Whether it's wealth or influence or electricity, all the power in the world is worthless if you can't access it where you need to. So today's topic is portable power and energy, and we're going to cover everything from the classic modern batteries up to peculiar stuff on the hazy edge of theory, like ultra-small black holes, antimatter, and bottled light. We're not really that interested in batteries for today's discussion though, nor are they our first portable energy source. In the past, we've used flywheels or big containers of water, like tidal mills, to store energy, but neither is very portable. Nor is firewood one of our first ways of storing energy outside what we'd use in our bodies, though it's actually more energy dense than even the best modern batteries. Of course, we've been storing food for far longer, and doing so predates humanity as a lot of critters scored food away. But we've been storing energy as triacylglycerols in fat cells, and as glycogen in liver and muscle cells, and even protein since long before life crawled out of the ocean. Batteries are technically devices for converting chemical energy into electrical energy, which is also reversible if the battery is rechargeable. Capacitors, on the other hand, store electrical energy directly as charge. There weren't any batteries when Benjamin Franklin started looking at electricity, which he called liquid fire at the time, but those earliest devices, Leyden jars, a basic form of capacitor, reminded him of a group of cannons, called a battery. I spent many years working artillery, and a friend once asked me if we called the guns in our company-sized unit a battery and the wads of gunpowder we'd load in them a charge, as some reference to electric batteries, and it's actually quite the reverse. Battery and electric charge both derive from cannons, and Franklin also coined conductor and positive and negative electric charge too, though those make more sense, even if some argue that positive and negative should be reversed. For today's discussion, we'll borrow the way Benjamin Franklin looked at the battery, basically anything you store energy in for future withdrawal to save time, and because fundamentally we don't actually care what type of energy is being stored or how, we just want to be able to store our energy for easy withdrawal and little loss during storage or difficulty moving it around and using it. But storing energy, storing food, storing money or information or anything else always has the same basic problems. It's valuable and you want to put it somewhere safe where it is convenient to access or move around, but storage always has a cost. A battery is a lot like a grain silo, our first real dedicated energy storage structure except maybe a woodshed. You need to take a lot of time and energy to build one, and to maintain it, and you need to guard that silo from rodents and weather and thieves, and even while the grain is safely stored, it's decaying, losing its food energy. Batteries are the same way, only far worse. Energy units can get confusing. Amp hours aren't exactly energy, but basically that's the term for it for batteries. It's a little cumbersome, like saying kilowatt hours instead of 3.6 megajoules, but it's the standard, same as food still tends to be given in calories instead of kilojoules, and lots of fuels are given in BTUs, or essentially miles or kilometer per gallon or liter. But fundamentally it's still energy, and all those terms can obfuscate how they all compare. Your typical 1.5 volt AA alkaline battery is 2.4 amp hours and weighs about 15 to 20 grams, meaning it is storing, when brand new, about 13,000 joules, or a bit under 1,000 joules per gram, and costs about $1. $1 will also buy you about 10 kilowatt hours of electricity, equal to 2,800 AA batteries, or about 40 kilograms of them. Of course, your wall socket isn't portable, and even a cord for nearby use is often quite a hassle. Considering those batteries are a few thousand times more expensive per unit of energy, not that much of a hassle. Thus, bigger energy-using devices either come with a plug or a small engine. Weight-wise, 40 kilograms worth of AA batteries contains less energy than a single kilogram of gasoline, about a third of a gallon. Wood, fat, and carbohydrates, our more classic energy storage systems, all fall short of gasoline in energy density, but not by that much, and store far more than an electric battery. Actually, about the only thing they match in energy density is the even order mechanical flywheel that you spin up and tap for rotational energy, of which the bicycle wheel and car wheels are among the last common modern examples. They also leak energy to air drag and friction even faster than the worst batteries and are anything but portable, They are large and bulky and actually very hard to walk around corners with due to conservation of angular momentum. We see more of a push to improve batteries nowadays, mostly because we've already so improved small electronic devices to need less power that they can actually run on the fumes of the typical battery. But if you loaded a pair of AA's into a microwave, they'd power it about long enough to heat a glass of water. A modern smartphone battery has about the same amount of juice in it when fully charged. Even laptops aren't much more. These devices use little power so they can run off batteries. Our batteries have gotten better, especially rechargeable ones, but ultimately it's the improved power efficiency that's allowed us to have more and more devices that don't have to be plugged in constantly to operate. Like I said earlier though, this is not an episode on batteries. It's about having power where you need it, and we don't care if that's by a battery, a solar panel, a fuel tank and a generator, or miles of power lines and local extension cords. I want to talk about a few of those methods before we launch into the high-tech options, because they tie into the real fundamental issue, which is getting your energy where you need it, when you need it, for the least hassle and loss. As mentioned for energy storage, we've got problems. You have to build and maintain that storage device. You've got losses filling it up, you've got losses while it stores it, and you have them when you make a withdrawal. To make it portable, you also have to drag it around, and batteries are very heavy, generally having only a small percentage of the energy and equal weight of the typical chemical fuel will have. Size matters too, not just weight, by making things cumbersome. For these non-battery approaches, we've got problems too. With power cords, you have the obvious problem. You need a cord, and I don't need to elaborate on the hassles involved there, as we know them all too well. They also require a big generator somewhere making energy, and countless kilometers of power lines that require space, right-of-way, heavy initial investment, continuing maintenance, and also bleed off precious energy due to the wires not being superconductors. I want to spend a little time explaining why losses in power storage and delivery are an important consideration. For an electrical cable, loss is proportional to the amount of current passing through a given length of conductor. And this was a major headache for the likes of Thomas Edison around the 1900s. The thicker the cable, the more efficiently it carries a given amount of current. Edison found that to get power at 110 volts DC to nearby homes and businesses required very thick, heavy, and expensive power cables, and even so, the losses to get power from a power station just a couple miles away to a house were staggering. Another famous man discovered something that revolutionized the way that we transport power. His stroke of genius was to use alternating current, or AC power, as opposed to direct current or DC power that Edison used. I am, of course, talking about Nikola Tesla here. What makes AC so brilliant is that you can easily transform it. Now, electrical power is the wattage that the electricity can deliver, and it is volts times amps, for single-phase systems anyway. If we put that power through a transformer, we can play with the ratio of the volts and the amps. So if we increase the voltage to thousands or even hundreds of thousands of volts, we can decrease the current proportionally. This means we don't need to have thick cables to carry the power on. This is the reason that the typical energy grid power lines run at anything from a couple of 100,000 volts to some that run close to millions of volts. It means that we can get power hundreds or even thousands of kilometers without huge losses and using relatively small cables. However, large voltages have their problems too, as the electricity can jump between conductors, and if you get zapped by a high voltage, one carrying even a moderately small current, it will electrocute you. We are trading off one type of problem for another. Ideally, you want wires with little to no resistance, but even if you could use superconductors, those need coolant that has to be made and replaced, and the amount of current that can be carried by a given conductor size is also limited as the conductor loses its superconductivity if too much current flows through it. Should we ever get a warm temperature superconductor, the coolant problem goes away, but the other problems remain. That is an example of how one tech can cause damage to the development of others though, and we see that a lot with energy. Some new improvement to some type of energy technology makes it better and the others worse, relatively speaking, so R&D drops off to those areas and slows improvement. We actually had solar power long before cars were common and most houses had electricity, but research in improving that died off, and indeed probably would have stayed dead if we hadn't invented semiconductors and improved them for their value in computing. We've been using wood and other biofuels a long time too, and had wood-powered vehicles, but seen very little improvement in those because gas and diesel were better. Ditto, even solar and wind have probably hampered improvements in safer and cheaper atomic energy, because they tend to be viewed as more ecologically attractive alternative energy sources, which is very debatable. Economics and perception matter a lot in this field though. So batteries and landline power we know well enough. How about a local generator? Of course we do that too. Lots of yard tools have their own gasoline engines, but these need to be fairly large, require additional maintenance, have reliability issues, acquiring and storing fuel, and also tend to be loud. We can't really do wind power for smaller objects either, as while it's great for windmills, it, like the flywheel, is quite cumbersome and large, and not something you can easily make smaller. If the wind dies off, or if your windmill is in a blocked or sheltered location, you get no power, meaning you need a battery or flywheel in it, or would need to blow on it. Solar isn't terribly energy dense either. 200 watts is a very good output rate for a square meter of solar panel under full sun, but you won't usually get that, and obviously not inside a building or at night. Even if you did though, it couldn't power a car. A horsepower, our unit of power for cars, is 746 watts, and you'd barely get just one if you coated the whole surface of a car in solar panels. It generally takes tens of thousands of watts just to maintain cruising speed of an automobile on a highway. Still, solar is a very attractive option in conjunction with batteries for powering smaller devices. Atomic power sources are also pretty tempting. Now, you can't get a thorium reactor into a car, but you can use radioisotope thermoelectric generators, RTGs, as a power source. Such things are phenomenally energy dense, on an order of millions of times that of any chemical fuel, and 1 billion times better than most batteries, though it drops off quite a lot as you add in shielding for radiation, and factor in the incredibly low efficiency of thermocouples, which have never broken 10% and generally do about half that. But these are incredibly durable objects lacking moving parts, that just put out a constant supply of power, and metamaterials hold promise to improve the efficiency of thermocouples in the foreseeable future. Most RTGs are pretty heavy affairs, able to turn out hundreds of watts for decades off only a few kilograms of fuel and a good deal more shielding. But we actually have something called a beta voltaic battery that can be quite small. The name comes from them running on beta radiation, which is electrons or positrons, and beta radiation can be stopped by virtually anything, including a thin piece of tin foil or your own top layer of dead skin. So you can take a quick beta decay isotope like strontium-90, half-life of 29 years, and have a power source that creates a steady supply of energy for decades. Indeed, we use these in order pacemakers and use tritium-based ones in a lot of tiny low-power, long-term devices. Two key caveats there though. First, the power supply is not actually constant. It slowly decreases over time, and at the half-life of the isotope will be down to half wattage. So a 20-watt strontium-90 beta voltaic battery would be down to 10 watts in 29 years, and 5 watts in 58 years. Second, it is a steady power supply. You can't stop it, it just keeps going and going and going at that wattage. Meaning unless your device needs a constant power supply of X amount, all the rest of that energy is being wasted. And if you need more than X power sometime, you will need a battery attached too. A new type of beta voltaic device that shows a lot of promise is the diamond battery. This device takes advantage of carbon-14, a radioisotope made in our own atmosphere by cosmic rays, or in graphite in fission reactors, and of course diamonds are made of carbon. The outer, non-radioactive carbon-12 slows electrons being emitted by the inner, mildly radioactive carbon-14. This is a very low-power device, just 3 watts, and isn't the most energy-dense, but it does allow for a more than 6,000-year lifetime before reaching half power, making it attractive for space missions and other remote or difficult-to-reach applications. These kinds of isotopes are expensive too. That's the real limit on RTGs. Not them being dangerous. An atomic power plant uses a reaction that causes fission. RTGs and the like rely on natural decay. Needless to say, things with half-lives of less than many millions of years are not found much in nature because they don't live long after the event that made them, which for many was some giant supernova billions of years ago. And tritium, the most popular to use, costs about $30,000 per gram, hundreds of times more than gold or platinum, though it produces about a watt of power and has a half-life of 12 years. Still insane though it sounds, you could power quite a few devices off that much juice, especially with an attached battery to handle peak use, and its cost comes from production. You need a fission reactor to make it, so there are scenarios where that could become much more plentiful in the future. Ignoring that cost, you could easily have a 10-watt tritium battery that with shielding and thermocouple loss included weighed no more than the typical smartphone battery and lasted decades. Or you could have, say, 3 or 4 smaller ones where you just staggered the usage and poured one for replacement every 5 or 6 years with no radiation concerns. Another option is not to use radioactive decay as your power source, but to use micro-fission reactors. The smallest thermonuclear reactor ever designed is only 4.6 kilograms, including all shielding, less than half a kilogram of americium-232. The most easily fissioned fissile fuel known that can sustain a chain reaction. It is dissolved in nitric acid, then this is mixed with water and placed in a sphere 9.6 centimeters across that serves as a neutron reflector and radiation shield. While this only produces a few hundred watts, the fission reaction can be throttled to meet energy demands, and it is able to be refueled or replaced. This is the smallest you can go for a reasonably traditional reactor, but there are experiments being conducted into other quarks of neutronics that may make it possible to go even smaller. 2 related concepts have been bounced around for a number of years: ultra-cold neutrons and tetraneutrons. Briefly, ultra-cold neutrons move very slowly and are thus more likely to be captured and cause a fission event, and tetraneutrons are a bundle of neutrons that are also more likely to be captured and cause fission. If we can advance this technology, we may be able to produce smaller, safer reactors that can actually be throttled quickly to allow you to produce power only in the amount you want when you want it. We also have energy beaming and wireless energy, and like the others, these are not new concepts but all seeing some more interest these days. Energy beaming is more of a space-based application, where instead of a wire, you beam light or microwaves to something like a spaceship or satellite. We discussed that here on SFIA a lot, so we'll skip it today. It's not very ideal for terrestrial applications. Wireless power, though, is seeing more use, due in part to the quantum uncertainty of power plugs and USB ports, which are always backward from whichever direction of the plug you are attempting to insert, particularly if said connector is in an awkward place to reach or see. Wireless power has its pros and cons too. Range is quite an issue, which is why most devices using it now require them to be practically physically touching to work, meaning that it's basically just an easy plug. But those are improving, and I wouldn't be surprised if that became common enough in homes in a decade or two that wireless started meaning power supply for devices rather than an internet connection. This is a good place to jump into the higher tech stuff. Even if we had a teleporter, like we discussed 2 weeks back, we can't just freely refuel things or move power, at least not under the methods that look like they might be allowed under known physics. But this is also one potential option, as is quantum energy teleportation. I generally tend to expect these to be impossible, or at least impractical, but we can't rule it out yet. Like energy beaming though, it potentially lets you move energy over huge distances and not have to carry it with you like fuel. And considering the big issue with such things is scaling it up past the atomic scale, microsizing it for portable electronics is presumably not the issue, rather the reverse, getting it even that big. We were also talking about atomic batteries as a great option, and they absolutely are if you can find a way to produce those low half-life, beta-decaying isotopes cheaper, and that derives from them being atomic rather than chemical, millions of times more energy dense. Another way to harvest energy from decay would be to develop gamma voltaic systems. These are basically a lot like solar panels, but working at a much higher frequency than visible light. Because of the way traditional photovoltaics work, the wavelength of the light and the size of the components actually converting the light into electricity are linked, so traditional silicon wouldn't cut it, even if the radiation wouldn't overwhelm the thing first. The 2 most promising options here are perovskites, which are already being used in the newest generation of solar panels, and biogamma voltaics, which are really interesting. Biogamma voltaics comes from a certain radiotrophic or radiation-eating fungi that have been studied fairly extensively in Russia. One of the most promising is a fungus that lives in the same room as the elephant's foot, or the melted-down corium from the Chernobyl meltdown. These fungi contain a lot of melanin, with basically just enough room to squeeze in the rest of the things that they need to live, and this melanin converts the gamma radiation into biochemical energy. Since most radioisotopes also produce gamma radiation, being able to use this to harvest power would truly be a game changer, not just for RTGs, but for antimatter devices as well. Antimatter lets us get even denser than atomic energy. Under Einstein's famous E=mc², a single gram of matter contains about 100 trillion joules of energy. As we mentioned earlier, you only can get maybe 1,000 joules out of an equal mass of batteries, and at most 100 times more than that out of a gram of chemical fuel. So raw matter-to-energy conversion batteries are around 1 billion times more energy dense than chemical fuels, and 100 billion times as dense as modern batteries. Now that would be the penultimate energy supply, just short of being able to yank power out of nothing, and we have two approaches that let us more or less do this. The first is antimatter, which is technically twice as good since it will render itself and an equal amount of regular matter into energy. It's more properly thought of as a battery too because there's no real source of naturally occurring antimatter in any significant quantity, you have to make it. And right now, not only can we not store it, but we need to spend millions of times more energy to make a bit of antimatter than it would release. Like being able to cheaply mass-produce radioisotopes, if we could ever mass-produce antimatter and safely store it, it would be an amazing power storage medium. Not only is it even more energy-dense than fissionable materials and radioisotopes, indeed it even outstrips fusion, but you can throttle your power output. An RTG produces a set power supply, constantly, whether you need it or not, and you can't squeeze any extra out. Antimatter is more like a fuel, you only burn it when you want to at the rate you want to. Since it has otherwise identical properties to normal matter, long-term storage without decay isn't really an issue, though considering touching any matter makes it explode, even short-term storage is an issue. But a big ball of anti-hydrogen or anti-iron left to itself isn't decaying, and can just sit there indefinitely awaiting use without loss to time and decay. You can also potentially use antimatter to catalyze fusion. We generally think of a fusion power source needing to be very large, but you might be able to make a very small one that ran on a little antimatter and much more common and mundane fusion fuel instead, which is nice unless you have very cheap antimatter production, more so since the assumption is the process will always require at least as much energy to be put in as you get out, whereas you might get a net positive output using it to catalyze fusion. Our other approach for raw matter-to-energy conversion is black holes. Now, needless to say, these are not normally portable, but as we discussed way back in micro black holes, you can potentially make very tiny ones by jamming a lot of energy into one place at once, usually by targeting a tiny spot with a huge array of lasers. Energy has gravity too, not just mass, and lasers are the only type of non-mass energy we usually can get anywhere near that dense. This is called a Kugelblitz black hole, and according to current theory they decay and release energy via Hawking radiation at a speed roughly inverse to the cube of their mass. Making one 10 times lighter means it lives only 1/10 cubed or 1,000th the time. It will also produce 10 squared or 100 times the power. We've talked about moving starships with ones weighing hundreds of thousands of tons, or fueling whole civilizations with far more massive but lower powered versions that will keep going for eons. However, you could potentially make very tiny but ridiculously high-powered ones too, ones that shine nearly as bright as a star for just a few seconds. This, needless to say, is pretty darn useless for most applications, as would be some billion-ton black hole producing only a few thousand watts, even if it did so steadily for 1 trillion years. But the solution comes with a problem. We regard these as batteries because it's virtually impossible to feed new matter into such a black hole, so they run out. This sounds counterintuitive since normally feeding a black hole is very easy, eating stuff is what they are best known for. But these tiny black holes are even tinier than an atomic nucleus, and so it's hard to get fuel into them while they are gushing out so much energy. It will push away the stuff you are trying to get in. It's kind of like trying to jam a beach ball into a hole in the wall the size of a dime while someone is spraying a pressure washer through the other side. So if you can feed one, you have a power generator rather than a battery, but trying to do so is nigh impossible. They also, like our RTGs, produce a set amount of power constantly, not on demand, though unlike them, that power rises as the black hole shrinks, instead of diminishing as the radioisotopes decay. Now last week we were talking about metamaterials, and possible perfect mirrors and better lenses, so let's imagine for the moment we had a truly perfect mirror around such a super tiny black hole. Everything keeps reflecting around and going back in eventually. Now you have an ideal battery, and you can use even a very low mass black hole for this, and just let some energy leak out in the amount you need. This is much easier said than done. For one thing, the energy released this way is going to be mostly gamma radiation, which we not only don't have any perfect mirrors for, but honestly any mirrors at all. But it may be possible. Still, fairly dangerous though, since the lighter ones are so short-lived that if they start leaking, it would basically explode. So feedable black holes or mirror-contained ones at the larger scale are possibly on the table, but one light enough to carry around in your pocket probably are not. That said, if you've got perfect mirrors, you maybe don't need a black hole for power storage. Instead of making a Kugelblitz black hole by shooting tons of lasers at one atom-sized spot, you shoot them all into a box with perfect mirror sides and close it up. All that light bounces around until you release it. This is definitely physically possible, even now. It's just miniaturizing it that's hard because light moves very fast and mirrors aren't perfect, though we've made some that are perfect for a single wavelength. Every bounce on an imperfect mirror loses some energy, so if you had a mirror box billions of kilometers long, you aren't getting many bounces and loss. Microsizing that to a useful size means your mirrors need to be perfect, at least for that wavelength of stored light. The energy density is the same as matter. Stick 100 trillion joules of photons in a box and it will weigh 1 gram more. This basically ties with antimatter as your penultimate battery, and depending on how mirror technology goes, might be the most plausible approach. Indeed, it might not be all that far off either. Again, we've made perfect mirrors for individual wavelengths. Can we do even better? Well, nothing beats entirely free energy produced wherever you want it in the amount you want it, and while we have no theory for that, vacuum energy potentially offers something pretty close. There's an awful lot of energy sitting around there in the seeming emptiness of the true void, and being able to tap that or dark energy or even reaching into other universes to snatch some are things we can't rule out for the future. But sadly, we also can't discuss them much, as we don't have anything approaching a solid understanding of any of those yet. This is something that Ian Banks described in his cultural novels with his grid-fire weapon, and this weapon truly dwarfs any other type of weapon that we could possibly obtain in this universe. That would, however, be the ultimate game changer. Vast amounts of energy available to you wherever you go, when you want it, that you didn't even have to lug around. The ultimate in portable power. Alright, we'll wrap up there for the day. One quick announcement before we get into the upcoming episodes. Folks have been asking me to make some channel merchandise for a long while now, and we finally got around to starting that up. The big request was for t-shirts and coffee mugs, and I was delaying a bit in large part because I wanted to make sure it wasn't junk that would melt in folks' dishwashers. Once we found a good company, Signal, we were ready to proceed. We will add to the available options as time and interest permit, but those are now available at signal.com and will be linked below in the video description. Next week, we will be looking at how humans and life in general need to adapt to live in the empty expanse of space. And probably not surprisingly, our SFIA book of the month is Leviathan Wakes, the first book of the Expanse series, whose TV adaptation has its third season premiering next week too. The week after that, we will go the opposite direction and talk about making habitats in space tailored to humans, with a detailed look at the O'Neill cylinder, the largest rotating habitat you can make from materials we can currently cheaply mass produce, and probably the first megastructure you would build in space. For alerts when those and other episodes come out, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and if you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button and share it with others, or donate to support future episodes at our website isaacarthur.net or Patreon, or of course you can buy some channel merchandise. Until next time, thanks for watching, and have a great week.